Have you ever quietly wondered whether one ordinary day, leaving home for work, going to a medical appointment, or stopping by a community gathering like you've done so many times before, might end up being the last day you are still considered lawfully present in the United States? As we move into the year 2026, deportation no longer begins with big mistakes or loud moments at the border. More often, it starts in the most ordinary situations, when everything still looks fine. A calm morning, a familiar appointment, a crowded community event. Then, a name is called at the right moment. A door opens, and suddenly, everything stops, without any explanation long enough to truly understand what is happening. What has shaken many Filipinos in 2026 is not only the fact that people are being taken away, but the realization that they never knew they were standing on such a thin line. There are no sirens, no police surrounding the area, no chaos, only a system quietly working in the background, making decisions before you even realize that the life you knew has reached a full stop. In this video, we will look at 10 cities across the United States, 10 different places, but with one shared truth. Filipinos living there believed they were simply living their normal lives until they discovered that safety in 2026 is no longer something that can be taken for granted. Number 10. Houston, Texas. You would think Houston is a safe place, especially if you work in healthcare, live quietly, and keep a low profile. The city has a large Filipino community, steady jobs, and everything looks like a life you can slowly put roots into. That was what Andrea, 37 years old, believed as well. She worked as a caregiver for the elderly. Her schedule was steady, no criminal record, no violations. She never once thought she belonged to any at-risk group. One morning in early 2026, Andrea went to a community clinic because of persistent back pain. She filled out the usual forms, just like many times before. There was only one small change: her new home address. She had recently moved in with an acquaintance to reduce rent. Nothing felt unusual, at least not from Andrea's point of view. What she did not know was that the person whose name was on the lease was already part of a separate review file involving taxes and public assistance. Two lines of data, two unrelated stories, quietly matched together by a system that does not ask questions. 3 days later, before the sky was fully bright, there was a knock on the door. No sirens, no flashing lights, no scene like in the movies, just a short conversation. Her name spoken correctly, her information already known. 15 minutes later, Andrea walked out of the rented room carrying a small bag. The breakfast she had started preparing was still on the kitchen table. No one came to cover her shift that day. What shocked the people around her was not that she was taken away, but how fast everything ended. So fast that no one fully understood what had just happened. In Houston, in the year 2026, the danger is not always in what you do. Sometimes it lies in being quietly pulled into someone else's story, through an address, a line on a form, or a connection you never thought was a risk. And if you think this is just an isolated case, the next city will show why silence has become the most frightening part of these new kinds of deportations. Number 9. Chicago, Illinois. Chicago is the kind of city where everything feels orderly, so much so that you can live there for years without ever feeling watched. There are no loud inspections, no street chases. And it is that very quietness that makes many people believe that if something were wrong, they would be warned ahead of time. Miguel, 29 years old, believed that too. He came to Chicago on a student visa, studied technology, lived with a few friends in the North Side, worked part-time regularly, and sent money home every month. After the pandemic, his school shut down. The transfer paperwork dragged on longer than expected, but Miguel stayed, thinking things were just moving slowly, not falling apart. One winter afternoon, Miguel stopped by a community support center to ask about affordable housing. He filled out his personal information carefully, hiding nothing, because he believed honesty was always the safest choice. 2 weeks passed with no calls. Then one day, during lunchtime, as he stood in line to buy food, someone gently tapped his shoulder and called his name, pronounced so clearly there was no mistake, no shouting, no resistance. People around him kept eating as usual. Miguel only had time to look back at the shop one last time before stepping outside. In Chicago, in the year 2026, what is frightening is not being taken, but how it happens. So quietly that even you are not sure which exact moment your life changed direction. And by the time you realize you are no longer in status, the chance to fix things has often been gone for a very long time. The next city will show that sometimes the risk does not come from your own records, but from the place where you live and the people you share space with. Number 8. San Francisco, California. San Francisco is a city where many Filipinos are forced to live together just to survive. Not because they want to bend the rules, but because rent is so high that living alone has become almost impossible. Karen, 33 years old, worked at a laundry shop in the Excelsior district. She shared a 2-bedroom apartment with her cousin and 2 other friends. They split the rent, split work shifts, and shared the quiet exhaustion of evenings after long days. They believed that as long as rent was paid on time and no trouble was caused, no one would care how they lived. Things began to change when the landlord announced a rent increase and demanded that they move out earlier than the lease allowed. Karen and the others refused. They knew they had done nothing wrong. A few days later, a civil complaint was filed with the city. No confrontation, no heated arguments. Just a few lines stating over-occupancy and a small detail added at the end, a suspicion about the residency status of those involved. What Karen did not know was that in San Francisco, these kinds of housing dispute records are carefully stored and quietly linked to other systems. 2 weeks passed in silence. Then one weekday morning, there was a knock on the apartment door. There was no arguing. No one ran. Just a document check. Out of the 4 people living there, only one had complete paperwork. Karen was instructed to make arrangements to leave within 1 month. What haunted her was not simply leaving the city, but the feeling that everything collapsed because of a rental dispute that felt painfully ordinary. In San Francisco, in the year 2026, you do not need to make a big mistake. Sometimes, appearing in a civil record is enough for the system to begin moving. And if you believe shared housing is only a risk in expensive coastal cities, the next story will show that even with stable work and clear contracts, things can still slip away very quickly. Number 7. Dallas, Texas. Dallas was once seen as a place where things were very clear. If you had a job, you had income. If you had a contract, you were considered stable. And if you worked in healthcare or elder care, there always seemed to be someone who needed you. Sophia, 42 years old, believed in that clarity. She came to Dallas under a work arrangement and was employed at a private care facility. Her schedule was full. The patients knew her. Management was satisfied because she never missed work without reason. On paper, Sophia's position was listed as temporary, but in real life, she worked full-time for nearly 2 years, 6 days a week. No different from any regular employee. She believed her paperwork had already been processed, or at least was still being reviewed, because no one had ever told her there was a problem. Everything continued as usual until the day the facility underwent an internal audit. It was not because of a complaint, not because anyone caused trouble, just a routine review. When the staff list was cross-checked, Sophia's name did not match a valid employment authorization record. Her visa had expired quite some time earlier, while her professional license and tax identification was still active. For Sophia, it was a shock. She had never thought she was working out of status when every day she wore her uniform, cared for patients, and received her salary like everyone else. But in Dallas, in the year 2026, there is a line many people do not realize exists. A professional license is not the same as legal residency. An employment contract does not mean your immigration file has been approved, and stability in daily life does not always reflect safety within the system. Sophia was not taken away that day, but from the moment her name appeared on that mismatch list, the clock quietly began counting down. And if you think stories like this only happen behind closed doors at work, the next city will show that sometimes simply appearing on a camera in a crowded place can change everything very quickly. Number 6. New York City, New York. New York is a place where you can blend into the crowd so easily that you start to believe you have become invisible. For many Filipinos, that feeling of invisibility creates a false sense of safety. Daniel, 31 years old, worked in elder care in Queens. He lived among streets that were always loud, grew used to being pushed on the subway and waiting at red lights with hundreds of other people. Early one weekend in 2026, he joined a small community festival. He helped at a food booth, laughed, and talked with friends, never thinking that his brief presence meant anything at all. Everything passed quickly. Just a few minutes in front of public cameras mounted around the area. Then Daniel returned to his usual routine. 3 days later, during the morning rush hour, as he tapped his card to enter the subway station, someone stepped behind him and calmly called his name, in a tone that sounded almost familiar. There were no handcuffs, no disturbance. People around them kept rushing for their trains as if nothing was happening. Daniel was only told that his records needed to be clarified further. What he did not know was that inside the system, one document in his family reunification file had been left pending due to missing information. His appearance at a crowded public event had quietly brought that file back into active review. In New York, in the year 2026, the risk does not come from doing something wrong. It comes from appearing at the exact moment the system needs more data to make a decision. When Daniel walked out of the subway station that day, he still did not understand that being called by name in the middle of the crowd was the moment his life quietly turned in another direction. And if you believe crowded cities always offer protection, the next story will show that sometimes the places where people think everyone is too busy to notice me are where everything ends the fastest. Number 5. Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles is a place where many Filipinos have lived long enough to believe they are past the risky years. When a case has existed for so many years without being denied, it becomes easy to assume it will eventually be approved, that it is only a matter of time. Victor, 45 years old, had lived in Los Angeles for more than 13 years. He worked in logistics, paid his taxes regularly, and never caused trouble. His application for protection was filed early on, accepted at the initial stage, and then left pending because the system was overloaded. Year after year, Victor continued working. He supported his family. He believed that if there were any problems, he would be called in to explain, just as he had heard from others. But as the year 2026 began, long pending cases were brought back for review in a very different way, faster, more streamlined, with far less room for waiting. One morning, while Victor was working as usual, his manager called him into the office and said someone wanted to see him. There was no tension, no argument, just a notice that his case had been reviewed again, and a decision had already been made a few days earlier. Victor could not understand how more than a decade of waiting could end in a single, short morning, without anyone asking him for additional information. What shook him was not only being taken away, but the realization that all those years of feeling temporarily okay had really been a quiet pause before the system returned to finish its work. In Los Angeles, in the year 2026, the danger is not always in having a case denied at the beginning. It lies in a case being left pending for so long that people begin to believe they are safe. And if you think stories like this only happen to old, forgotten files, the next city will show that sometimes just one small detail in family paperwork is enough for everything to collapse within a few hours. Number 4. San Diego, California. San Diego is the kind of city that makes many people believe that once you have a stable family, things become safer. When there is a husband or wife, children, and a settled routine, life feels like it has entered a different stage, less fragile than before. Teresa, 39 years old, believed that. She lived with her husband and 2 children in a quiet neighborhood in the southern part of the city. She took her children to school every morning, went to work regularly, and spent most of her life centered around her family. Her adjustment of status application had been filed many years earlier, and because she never received any request for additional documents, Teresa assumed everything was simply waiting its turn. What she did not know was that during a system review, her case had once been returned due to a missing notarized document. And that notification never reached her. No email, no phone call, no reminder letter. One morning in early 2026, while Teresa was preparing breakfast for her children, there was a knock at the door. The conversation was very short, long enough for her to understand that a decision had already been made. There was no time to call a lawyer, no chance to ask for a delay, no moment to explain how long her family had lived there. What broke Teresa was not only having to leave, but the feeling that everything had been decided based on lines of paperwork she was never given a second chance to see. In San Diego, in the year 2026, the risk does not come from failing to file a case. It comes from believing that filed means finished. And if you think having a family will slow the system down long enough for you to understand what is happening, the next city will show that in some places, even trust itself is no longer a safe zone. Number 3. Phoenix, Arizona. For many Filipinos, the church had long been the last place they felt they could trust, not because of the law, but because of the sense of protection that comes from being among a familiar community. Mark, 35 years old, lived with his wife and young son inside a church compound in Phoenix for nearly a year. They stayed out of sight, avoided attention, and waited quietly for a humanitarian decision on his case. Their life was very still. Morning prayers, small chores in the afternoon, doors closed early at night. Each day looked almost exactly the same, to the point that Mark began to believe silence itself was what kept his family safe. But as the year 2026 arrived, places once considered safe zones slowly lost their old meaning. One Sunday morning, just after the service had ended, while people were still talking in the hallway, someone entered through a back door. There was no disturbance, no interruption of the service. Mark's name was called. The conversation was brief, just long enough for him to understand that the decision had already existed for quite some time. At that moment, the church was still full. Voices and laughter continued around him. But for Mark, it was as if all sound had suddenly been turned off. What stunned those who witnessed it was not only that he was taken away, but where it happened, inside a space everyone believed was sacred and untouchable. In Phoenix, in the year 2026, the risk does not come from being too visible. It comes from believing there are places the system will not reach. And if you think stories like this only happen in states with strict laws, the final two cities will show that once the list has already been made, location becomes only a minor detail. Number 2. Miami, Florida. Miami is a city of long shifts, of tourism, restaurants, and cruise ships, where many Filipinos work under agency contracts and grow used to signing papers quickly just to start the job on time. Ryan, 34 years old, worked as a kitchen assistant on a Caribbean cruise ship. He put in 12-hour days, often with hardly any breaks. His focus was simple: finish each shift, send money home on schedule, and rest when he could. His contract was signed through a familiar agency. Everything moved fast, just like dozens of paperwork signings he had done before. Ryan barely noticed one line in the job description that did not perfectly match his visa classification. He did not think it mattered. He was doing the same work, getting paid properly, and had never been warned about any issue. What he did not know was that the agency handling his contract had already been placed under review for widespread documentation inconsistencies. When that list was forwarded, no one separated cases one by one. They looked at names, not stories. One morning, Ryan received a brief notice telling him to prepare to leave the United States within a very short period of time. Not because he had clearly done something wrong, but because his name appeared in the same group of files as others. In Miami, in the year 2026, the risk does not lie in your daily actions. It lies in where you signed your name and with whom, sometimes far in the past. And if you believe that, at the very least, decisions are still carefully reviewed by people at the final stage, the last city will show that in many cases, the decision was already made before anyone had time to ask a single question. Number 1. Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not the city with the largest Filipino community, nor is it the first place people think of when talking about risk. Yet it is a place where many important decisions are tested before spreading across the country. Clara, 32 years old, was an ESL teacher working under a legal contract. Her visa was still valid. Her record showed no criminal history or clear violations. Her life was fairly simple: teaching classes, preparing lesson plans, attending training sessions, and occasionally traveling between states as required by her work. Early in the year 2026, Clara was preparing to fly to another state for a short training program. All her documents were in order, her passport was valid, her contract was still active, but at the airport, just before passing through security, she was asked to step aside, not for additional luggage screening, but to re-verify her case status. Clara did not understand what was happening until she was informed that her visa had already been temporarily suspended earlier, based on an internal review related to her sponsoring organization, where one line in the job description was considered not sufficiently clear. There was no argument, no lengthy explanation. The decision had already existed before Clara ever arrived at the airport. In Washington, D.C., in the year 2026, you do not need an expired visa to be at risk. Sometimes, being placed under review by the system is enough, and once the decision is activated, people are no longer there to ask questions, only to carry it out. Clara left the airport that day without fully understanding what had caused everything to end so quickly, other than knowing it did not begin with a major mistake, but with one very small line of data. 10 cities, 10 different stories, but one common thread runs through all of them. Not a single person believed that day would be the day everything stopped. There were no clear warning signs, no moment of advance notice, only decisions made quietly, long before those involved realized they were standing at the edge. The year 2026 is not a year of loud deportations. It is a year of very quiet endings, where people leave without fully understanding why, and those who remain are left with only one question: could this happen to me? And if there is one thing these stories make clear, it is this: the feeling of safety at this time is no longer something that can be assumed, even when everything still looks completely normal.